Now let's think about how we would design a simple rules-based bot. A rules-based bot is designed to follow a very specific plan. That means that we know what cards are available, and we know what the community cards are, and we make our decisions based on the hand that we can perform at that time. This is a very basic way to provide some bot logic because it says, based on the fundamentals of the game, the odds we think we have of winning, and whether we want to raise the bet or if we want to call the bet or fold, all just for what we know. Now the important thing to note about this is that there's nothing random. Sometimes you might want to put in some random behavior to occasionally raise when you just call, or maybe call when you might fold, just as a pseudo bluff. But in this case, we're not doing anything random. We're also not doing any bet optimization. So if we have a really good hand, we're not trying to get the most chips out of everyone else as we can. Another thing we're not doing is bluffing. That's a pretty advanced concept to determine when you'd want to bluff, and you could do it with a rules engine, but in our case, we're not going to do anything with bluffing. And we're also not going to do any behavioral modeling. The behavioral modeling is a pretty advanced topic where we try to determine, based on the bets of the other players, what sorts of hands they might have. So in this case, the rules our bot's going to follow are very simple. The first thing is, in the opening stage, if we have a pair, we're going to raise. Otherwise, we'll end up calling. For the flop, we'll raise if we have a two pair, and we'll call if we have just a pair. In the turn, we'll raise on a three of a kind, and we'll call if we have at least a pair. And on the river, we'll raise if we have a straight or better, and then finally, if we have two pair, we'll call. Now, if none of the above apply, we're simply going to return 0 chips, which will result in a check or a fold, depending on the current call value. Now we can get back in Visual Studio to create our new rule-based bot. We'll start with the starter bot like before, only we're going to make some edits down here. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to delete these lines of code, just to get them out of the way since we won't use them. We will leave the return 0 since our ultimate end case for catch-all is, in the event that we get all the way to the end, we're going to return 0 for our chips. Now we had talked about switching our initial logic based on what stage we were in. And so there's really nothing better to use there than a switch statement itself. So we're going to switch on the current table stage, and we're going to build up a bunch of cases, and those cases will map to the specific stages that we have available. So I'm just going to put in some basic code for the opening, and then I'm going to copy and paste this down so we can use it over and over again. So we've got the opening, we've got our flop, we've got the turn, and then of course we've got the river. And now we've got our 4 stages that are handled, but there's no actual logic in there. Well, for the opening, what we said is we wanted to put in some code that would say if our best hand, and if we go into table we can see my hand, best hand, and this tells you the nature of what hand you have. So the options are the ones you'd expect to see, like pair and straight flush and all of that. So if our best hand is a pair, what we want to do is we want to return the minimum amount we need in order to raise. So I'm going to use the minimum to raise amount. And you have to remember you want to return that, and that tells the execution engine to stop at this point, to take this value here, the minimum raise amount, which would probably be 2 or 4 chips depending on where we are in the first hand, and progressively higher later on, and return that as our bet. Now if this is not true, what we can do is we decided we're always going to call. So instead of breaking, I'm just going to say return the table's call amount. So if we don't have a pair, we're always going to call, so we'll always at least stay in the game. Now one of the important things that could be careful to notice here is the best hand we could have at this point is a pair. And that is because, working within the context of these hands, we only have 2 cards at this stage of the opening, since there's no community cards that have been dealt yet. However, one thing that happens is if we tried to copy this code that was here and paste it in for the flop, the challenge is, at this point there's 5 cards we could work with. So we may have a pair and that would be good, but we might have better than that. But the dangerous thing is we're using the equal sign, which means that in the event that it was better than a pair, this would not be true. So what we actually want to do, since we decided that in the flop we were going to raise if it was a 2 pair or greater, is we're going to make this line of code a little bit different. So it says if the table on my hand, best hand, is greater than or equal to 2 pair, then we're going to raise. Otherwise, else if the table is my hand, best hand, is greater than or equal to hands.pair, then we're going to return the table's call amount. And if that's not true, then we'll break and it'll fall down and we'll return our 0 here. But this code here is pretty basic, and we can actually copy it and reuse it down for the turn and for the river. But in the turn, we had decided that we wanted to have at least a 3 of a kind in order to raise, and we would still have a pair as our raise amount for the turn. And then for the river, we wanted to have at least a straight, and we would be happy to call if we had at least 2 pair. So now we've got our basic rules in place. And don't worry about following these directly. We're going to have a document so that you can copy this code or modify it as you want in your own bot. But now we've got all our logic in place. So we can come back up here and either choose Start Debugging from the Debug menu, or we can click the Start Debugging button. And it's going to build our project. It's going to launch our bot in the test client, and we can click New Matchup. We use the default settings here, and I'm going to pick my bot, and then I'm going to have my bot play against 4 call bots. Now the call bot's an interesting animal because what it does is it will always call the betted hand. So it's not always the interesting bot to play against, but the place where you'll notice that we're going to have an advantage is that since it always calls bets, if we ever have a better hand than it does, it will constantly stay in. So as we move down, we can see the call bot won 2 games, and then it won a 3rd game. But eventually we're going to find a hand where we had better cards. And here we can see the C# bot had better cards. This is our bot here in the blue. We had 2 pairs, with the high pair being an ace, or a pair of aces. Now you'll notice in the flop, because we had configured it so that it would raise in the event that we had at least 2 pair, you can see that it raised in the flop and everybody else called it here, and then they checked all the way through and we won. And now if we go through, I'd imagine what we're going to see is as we get better hands, we should get the opportunity to actually make more chips on any given hand, because the blinds are going to start going up, and eventually our bot's going to be able to find a good enough hand that it can really start to make some money on. So actually not finding a very good example in here so far, but I suspect as we go in here, and here's a good example. Now we found a hand here where the C# bot was very fortunate, had a flush ace, and we found that because we started off with a face card, we definitely stayed in, even though there were some calls in here, and we just checked, but then on the turn, our flush must have hit, so we raised and everybody called it, and then we still had a flush in the river, so we raised and everybody called it. And as we go down the line, we won again later on, and if we went all the way to the bottom, I'm going to guess we probably win overall. Yeah, here we go, because our cards worked out. The call bot's a fairly easy bot to beat, but we can see with a little bit of logic, with our rules, we were able to build a better bot and win on the first shot. Now that we've built our invincible bot, what we want to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to submit it at FinalBot.com. To submit your bot, open up your browser of choice and navigate out to FinalBot.com and sign in if you're not already signed in, and then go up to My Bots. And on the My Bots page, it'll show you the bots, all the competitions and the ones you have bots in. In our case, we have one in the Hold 'em competition. I'm going to click Edit. It'll ask me to browse to my bot and then allow me to submit it. So if I click the Browse button, I just need to find the bot. Now in the case of Visual Studio projects, or most projects, also if you use MonoDevelop, inside the SDK folder and inside the C# folder, you'll pretty much always have a folder structure like this regardless of the tools you're using. So if you go into your project, there will be a bin directory for the binaries, and then inside that a debug directory and possibly a release one. In our case, inside the debug directory, we're going to go and look for the bot that we created. Now in our case, it's finalbot.holdem.bot.dll. This is specifically the bot that we created, and it's the only file we want to upload. These ones that start with finalbot.bots.common, finalbot.common, finalbot.holdem.common, and any other thing you see in here, we don't need to submit. We just want the one bot we created. And it should look a lot like the name of the solution that we opened. So I'm going to select that file, click Open. I'm going to click the Submit button, and it's going to accept my bot. And after my bot's been uploaded, it's now eligible to run in regular tournaments. And so I'll be able to see after um, the tournaments run, and these can run on a regular basis. We have a couple tournaments that run regularly now. We might add some more in the future. When I come back tomorrow, I'll be able to see how my bot performed in its first round of tournaments.